4:30 where you are, 2:30 where I am, and you've arrived at Food Forest as educational settings. Hopefully you're in the right place, but if not, stay anyways, because it's going to be an awesome hour together. I know that many of you are joining us from the Toronto area, so I've put a local land acknowledgement on the screen for you, and you're all welcome to say hello from wherever you are in the chat. I am joining you today from Calgary in Treaty 7 territory, the traditional lands of the Blackfoot Confederacy, including the Siksika, Piikani, and Kainai and Tsuut'ina Nations, Stoney Nakoda First Nation, and Métis Region 3. The Indigenous people of Treaty 7 have a long-standing and deep connection with the land that is founded on respect and holistic relationship that has been developed and nurtured over time. The natural world is also a part of who I am, and I am developing my own relationship with the environment, either through spending time outdoors or teaching and learning alongside my own children and you, my education colleagues from across Canada. I'm sharing this today in hopes that we can enter into a conversation with and this new relationship with respect for each other, our shared lands, as well as our connections to the environment. My name is Catherine Wagner. I'm a board member for ECOM and the program director for Inside Education. I'll facilitate our hour together. I'm also joined by Georgia, who is the amazing Zoom host and working all her tech magic in the background for our session today. But you're not here to meet either of us. You're here to meet the two amazing speakers. We have Joanna and Jessica. Joanna Chin is a scholar, educator, activist who has worked on food sovereignty projects in community, from policy making to the building of food forests. Joanna is a doctoral student at the York University in Environmental Studies, working on the human-nature relationship centered on engagement and conversation and practice of biodiversity, as well as connections to non-formal environmental education. Jessica Robertson has designed public and private perennial food and sustainable water systems across southwestern Ontario. She teaches workshops in foraging and permaculture permaculture design with Wildcraft Permaculture. She has a background in biology and outdoor experiential education from Queen's University and a master's in city planning from the University of Manitoba. So I will turn it over to you both to teach us all about food forests. Remember to put your questions in the chat and we'll get to them at the end. So I'll stop my screen sharing and let you do that.
Great, thank you, Catherine.
You're welcome.
I'm going to go. All right. So Joanna and myself are both located in London, Ontario, and we're in the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, as well as the London Township and Sombra Treaties of 1796 govern this land. The Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and Lenapehoek and Attawandaron peoples are the traditional peoples that lived in this area. And currently there are many Indigenous peoples that make London their home, including the Chippewa of the Thames First Nation, Oneida Nation of the Thames, and Munsee Delaware Nation. Joanna and I stand in solidarity with the struggles of Indigenous people in Canada and around the world. And I will let Joanna introduce what we're going to speak about for the next hour with you.
Thanks, Jessie. So we'll be sharing two case studies of London, Ontario's food forests with you today. We'll start by introducing the concept of food forests and their history, and share the specifics of the projects that we've been involved with and how they've been utilized by nearby schools.
Joanna, can you see the poll option? I think I have to stop screen sharing in order to launch the poll, or stop my...
No, actually, it'll work. So we're going to ask you a few questions before we get started so we can get a sense of what you're working with or working at your school. So I'll launch the poll here.
It doesn't seem like there's too many more answers coming in. So perhaps there are people who aren't actually teaching at a school and they're working in different roles in the system. So they're not applicable to them.
So I'll end it here.
Yeah, I think so.
Okay.
So interesting. No's were the majority for most, although it's almost 50-50% actually. School gardens, outdoor classroom, and okay, great. Well, hopefully we'll inspire you to get going on a food forest for your school by the end of the talk.
We'll start with the video of Martin Crawford and his forest garden. Martin Crawford is one of the pioneers of food forests in the UK. So I'll take that poll away.
If you do nothing to a piece of land in temperate climates, it will become a forest. The forces of nature are actively moving the land towards a balanced, sustainable, and resilient ecosystem. This is called succession. In southwest England, an unusual forest is growing. Nut trees, fruit trees, shrubs, and perennial vegetables are...
Sorry. Sorry, I moved my mouse. Stop. Let me see if I can fast forward a little bit.
Are actively moving the land towards a balanced, sustainable, and resilient ecosystem. This is called succession. In southwest England, an unusual forest is growing. Nut trees, fruit trees, shrubs, and perennial vegetables are planted in a way that mimics a natural woodland. This forest garden is the life's work of Martin Crawford, an unconventional gardener who grows 500 edible plants with just a few hours of maintenance per month.
What we think of as normal in terms of food production is actually not normal at all. Annual plants are very rare in nature, and yet most of our agricultural fields are full of annual plants. It's not normal. What's normal is a more forested or semi-forested system. Forest gardens in a temperate climate tend to have 7 layers or so: high trees, smaller trees, shrubs, perennials, ground cover layers, root crops, and climbers. So it includes directly useful plants, many types of fruit trees, both the common ones and much less common fruit trees, all the types of nuts, tuber crops, vegetables, medicinal plants, timber, but also logs that you might grow other things on, like mushrooms. There are also plants of indirect use, system plants, to help the system function better, and that includes nitrogen-fixing plants, mineral accumulators, plants to attract beneficial insects to eat all your pests. Forest gardens are very beautiful places to be in, because although they're managed, the management is light, so they have this very naturalistic feel to them, and it is more like being out in nature than being in a cultivated garden. It can seem a bit overwhelming. There's so many different species. You shouldn't let that stop you from beginning a project, because you don't have to know everything to begin with. Just start, plant some trees, and go from there. It's not the gradually increasing temperatures that damage plants. It's the increase in extreme events, big storms, big winds, very heavy rain, hail, droughts. By having a very diverse system, whatever happens to the weather, most of your crops will probably do fine. Some may fail, some may do better. That's very important going into the future, because we don't know exactly what's going to happen to our weather. So by having a diverse system, it gives you maximum resilience.
So I'll describe a little bit of about what is a food forest. Food forests are also known as forest gardens, and they can grow a cornucopia of food, including mushrooms, herbs, vegetables, nuts, fruits, and even medicinal plants. Once established, they require minimal human intervention as they're designed to be regenerative and self-sustaining. From small urban environments and suburban backyards to large acreages or farms, food forests can thrive in many contexts and scales.
So this is another short video of a walkthrough of the West Lyons Food Forest, which is one of the case studies that we're going to be talking about today. So this is a much younger food forest than Martin Crawford's, and you can see on the left of me in the picture, there's very little vegetation there. That was the second phase of the project. So this looks very different now. This was taken 2 years ago. So it's filled in quite a bit since then. But this will give you an idea of what a much younger, sunnier food forest looks like. Oops.
Hi, I'm Jessica Robertson with Wildcraft Permaculture, and we're at the West Lyons Food Forest, which is the latest food forest initiative in London, Ontario. A food forest will eventually look sort of like a natural forest, but it won't be as dense. There'll be a lot more light coming through, and all of the plants are selected to be edible or medicinal or useful in some way to us. It's very purposely designed. In a natural forest, we have 7 layers, and in a food forest, we also have 7 layers. There's an overstory, an understory, a shrub layer, herbaceous layer, root layer, mycelium, and vines. We really tried to select things that are going to be aggressive and take lots of space, like comfrey, and this is also a dynamic accumulator, so it's bringing up lots of nice nutrients, send those nutrients back into the soil and make them available for the trees around. So this is oregano, one of the ground covers that we're using. You can see it's just buzzing with bees. There's lots of bumblebees, and I see different kinds of flies and beetles and lots of different kinds of bees on it. So it's a great pollinator plant. You can also see it's a really nice big clump, and there's no grasses growing up in between it at all. So balloon flower is a nice addition to the food forest. The new growth at the tip is edible. This time of year, it's already going to seed, so it's past its stage. But earlier in the year, you can eat the new growth as it comes, the leaves. Throw it in a salad or cook it like a pot herb. So this is a rose. I think this one is called Snow Pavement. It's a white rose. But it's a rugosa rose, so it makes really nice big hips. That's why we planted them in this garden, in the food forest. We've got several different kinds of rugosa roses. So these are not quite ready yet. When they get a little darker red, they'll be nice and fleshy, and they're really high in vitamin C. And you don't want to eat the seeds though, so you eat the flesh around the seeds and take out the seeds, or just use them whole if you're drying them for tea later. So the West Lyons Food Forest is a gleaning forest. It's available for anybody in the city to come and harvest from, or just relax and enjoy, or volunteer in if you wanted to come and do some weeding or watering, and visit with people. Sanctuary London is here on Thursday mornings from 10 to 12, so if you wanted to come and meet some people and learn a bit more about some of the plants, they might be able to help you with that. This was an initiative through the neighbourhood decision-making process in London, so it was voted on by the community as this was an initiative they wanted to put funding towards. And it's a great project. It's still evolving. It's going to be probably 20 or 30 years before it's really fully established and at its most productive. But there's already lots happening, and every year there'll be more coming into production, and come and have a taste.
Oops. So food forests are not a new concept. They're one of the oldest forms of land cultivation. They existed in prehistoric times and in diverse climates in many countries around the world. There are the pet cot or orchard gardens of the Yucatan Peninsula, the chaga gardens that are built onto the slopes of Kilimanjaro in Tanzania, and the polyculture gardens in Kerala of South India are just some of the examples of places where they have existed for a long time. In North America, indigenous peoples have been modifying forest systems to enhance production of desired harvests for millennia as well. And they weren't necessarily recognized as food production systems by Europeans when they arrived, because they didn't farm that way in Europe. And they didn't realize that the landscape was highly modified for food production. So as I mentioned, and Martin also mentioned in the two videos, there are 7 layers in a food forest typically, which mimics natural forest systems. So there's the overstory, the understory, the shrub layer, a herbaceous layer, root crops, and then vines and mycorrhizal fungi that tie everything together and share nutrients and resources between the different elements, as well as producing their own yields occasionally. So a food forest is designed to be a multi-purpose system that has many yields. These yields are for humans as well as for our animal and insect kin. And we list these as the 7 F's: food, pharmaceuticals, fiber, fertilizer, fodder or forage, fuel, and fun, because that's important to have in any system, especially when you're working with kids. And there's so much to get out of food forest or forest garden system with children. There's so many different ways to engage with it. So now Joanna will talk about the Gibbons Park project, and then I'll talk about the West Lyons food forest.
How was the food forest started? I was aware that the City of London was offering funding through a trainee neighborhood matching fund. This fund provides London residents with money to plant trees on private property in neighborhoods. I pitched the idea to Kim and Grace, who are the co-owners of the Gibbons Park Montessori School. It's a private school that's situated within a larger public park called the Gibbons Park, where my then 3-year-old daughter attended school. So I talked to some neighbors to get their support and to pledge donations, and connected to like-minded community groups like the Squeaky Wheel Bike Cooperative, the Urban Roots London, St. George Grosvenor Neighborhood Association, Urban League, and UWO's Community Service Learning Department. And I asked for letters to support our grant application. After 3 months of waiting, we were one of 5 successful applicants that received funding from this community grant. The Gibbons Park Montessori Food Forest was implemented through 2 installation dates. On May 28, 2017, we did a site prep and planted the fruit trees. On June 21st, 2017, we planted the remaining plants that consisted of berry shrubs, roses, pea shrubs, foxglove, strawberries, and a lot of herbs. We had around 70 community members that attended the 2 events. They were given, the community members that attended the initial event were given either a pear, apple, or prune tree. And on October of that year, we partnered with a nonprofit organization called Reforest London to host a free workshop that was conducted by Jessie on basic pruning, pest control, and boosting fruit tree resilience to protect against disease and pests, so that people who attended the event would have the know-how to maintain their own fruit trees in their garden. So the food forest is maintained Lise Blocker, who's a retired school teacher at the school, and I were the main volunteers at the garden. We take care of the watering and weeding, but there's sometimes parent volunteers that help us before and after school. So Jesse developed a design for the food forest that you can see here. This is a design map. It's approximately 1,000 square feet in size. We planted a total of 6 fruit trees, 15 shrubs, and 139 supporting plants. We planted apple, Asian pear, and pear trees, and that was to coordinate with the school season from September to June. And shrubs include roses, gooseberries, currants, haskeps, and pea shrubs. And after about a year, the neighbor that was adjacent to the school donated some stone. So we've since created a stone path that meanders through the garden that children and their parents like to walk through before and after school.
So the West Lyons Food Forest, some of this I mentioned in the video, but repetition's always good for learning. So it was initially funded through the pilot project of the Neighborhood Decision-Making Program. They started it in the ward that this park is in, and trialed it there for a year before they moved it to the rest of the city. And so it was funded with $5,000 in 2017 through that program. And that $5,000 was to cover the design, materials, and plants. And once a project is funded through that program, there's no follow-up support or funding from the city. So it was very important to have strong neighborhood engagement. Gabor Sass was the individual who pitched the idea of the West Lyons Food Forest to the Neighborhood Decision-Making Program. And he had previously started a smaller food forest in a pocket park in his neighborhood that has been very successful. And it's quite small. I mean, the pocket park is small itself, and then the food forest there is quite small. This one is a half acre, which is quite a bit of land to manage, and it was really ambitious. But we've got a good crew of people that are taking care of it, and flyers were dropped in neighbors' mailboxes, and people were engaged as they walked through the park. Even now, there's still people who walk through the park and stop and ask volunteers, what is this, and what are you doing? Can I get involved? And some of those neighbors that were initially seemed interested and engaged with it didn't really pan out. There haven't been, they haven't been barriers to the project moving forward, but a lot of them didn't really show up to do any work or participate. And I'm not sure if they come and walk through it on their own when we're not around, but not everybody has been engaged in the events in the way we would like. But as I mentioned in the video, Sanctuary London, which is a nonprofit group in London that takes care of street active people and provides food and community for them, and around religious gathering. They meet there every Thursday morning and bring snacks and eat snacks from the garden, and they do some weeding and watering, and they've been very instrumental in the success of this project. And then the school, the London Christian Academy, is actually about 50-60 meters away from the food forest, and so their grade 6 class has been quite involved in using it for learning, and they were involved initially in the planting. I don't think they do too much care for it at the moment, partly for what the feedback I got was it's not knowing what is a weed and what's not, and what should be left, and not necessarily being given the direction they need to help out. So the design for the West Lyons Park, because we had a lot more area to work with here. We put in some larger nut trees like hicans, which are a hickory pecan hybrid, and quite a number of fruit trees. And we weren't constrained by the school season as we were with the Montessori school. So we have production going on here across the year. And we included some more unusual species here as well, like medlars and pawpaws. And the city did request a few things be removed from the design that they were worried would become aggressive or escape into the some of the not the wildlife corridor that's to the west of the food forest. So we removed that and made those changes. We have a barrier of raspberries and blackberries along the south edge. Part of it, deer pressure is big in both of these areas. So using larger tree stock that will eventually be out of their reach in terms of the fruit trees and things was a key decision. And then in this park, we tried to use prickly bushes around the edges, including raspberries and sea buckthorn and the rugosa roses at the entranceways and things like that.
So there's been a resurgence in food forests, we think, because of the perspective of seeing ourselves as part of the ecosystem, as opposed to seeing ourselves outside of the ecosystem. This connection, we think, is what got us into the trouble that we're in with climate change and biodiversity loss. So food forests are designed to be high intensity, low maintenance systems. Each component of the system enters a mutually beneficial relationship that is more than the sum of its parts. They're structured around biodiverse plants and animal communities, making them incredibly productive. In other words, a food forest can provide an abundance of food more than a traditional garden can. So Robert Hart points out that obviously few of us are in a position to restore the forest, but tens of millions of us have gardens or access to open spaces such as industrial wasteland where trees can be planted, and a full advantage can be taken of the potentialities that are available in heavily built city areas. New city forests can arise. So most people in North America live in urban and suburban neighborhoods, and some have access to a small plot of land. So we see that there's a great potential for food forests to sprout up in these areas because they can be tailored to fit urban and suburban environments. There were opportunities that arose with both our direct involvement with the food forest and with the installation of the food forest at the school. Oftentimes when we couldn't identify something, we would engage in self-directed nature-based learning to find out what it was, whatever it was that piqued our interest and curiosity. For example, there was a red digger wasp that was digging into the sand and making a nest for winter. And I would take some of these learnings back to my own garden and experiment creatively with plants and polycultures to see what works and what doesn't work, and try to improve and make changes. It's just this constant experimentation. We were often amazed by the creatures that we saw there, and we developed relationships with some of them. There was a groundhog that we were constantly battling with. He or she would bring a whole bag of leaves and stuff them into the hole, and we would try to cover up the hole only to discover a new hole next to the original hole. At first, the groundhog would run away when it saw us, but then I could get pretty close to it without alerting it to run away. The other volunteer that I talked about, we saw it as a place to meditate and reflect when we were working and to let the mind go. For me personally, the food forest has been part of a personal journey of decolonization. So much of what we learn in formal educational curriculum from K-12 and onwards, especially in the sciences, teaches us to break things into fragments, to think in binaries, to look from the outside in as an observer. So putting my hands into the ground has been a way to reclaim my relationship to the earth, to restore this relationship, to create connections and relationships and community. The food forest has given me an opportunity to cultivate the arts of noticing. When you think of that rich history of natural history practices and being embodied and observing plants and animals in the more than human world, the food forest calls you to pay attention to things that are happening right in front of us and to be deliberative, purposeful, and slow with our interventions. Everything is interacting at its own pace, not with this linear concept of time. With regards to the children, we didn't have direct involvement in the curriculum because we're not teachers at the school, although we both do education work. We sometimes direct activities like asking for rocks to be painted to create a boundary for plants. We created a wildflower section in the garden. We noticed that some parents and children would walk through the meandering path after school and smell and touch the plants along the path. We observed the teachers conduct guided yoga exercises and poetry readings on the grassy patch adjacent to the food forest. The children were involved in a monarch butterfly life cycle assignment where they observed the eggs go from caterpillar to chrysalis to adults. This involved the children feeding milkweed to the caterpillars. The teachers would take the children to the food forest to observe monarchs, as well as the different butterflies and pollinators that go there. There were some community building opportunities. I mentioned the free workshop earlier on basic pruning, pest control, and boosting fruit tree resilience. We work with a London resident to develop this idea for a food forest bicycle tour, and that happened in the fall of 2017. Since the food forest was installed, we had other workshops at the school in which other community members were involved. There was one on starting seeds. The children started some easy to grow vegetable seeds and observed the growing process, drew the plants and growing process inside the classroom. And we also had some foraging and nature walks guided by community members as well.
So in terms of the feedback that I got from the London Christian Academy, was that really it was the grade 6 teacher that was using the food forest to especially study biodiversity, and they helped with digging, raking, and laying down the cardboard when the food forest was first started, and then have done a little bit of maintenance since then, but not very much. They do go out to the food forest at least twice a year to look at how things have grown and changed and discuss that. They have to do plant identification, choose 5 plants and take pictures of them, figure out what they are, and then report back to the class on it. There's also been a knowledgeable parent involved in the school who's helped with plant identification and teaching the students and the teacher about what the roles of the different plants are in the system and how to sustainably harvest them. I think there's also an opportunity for food equity, and not just bringing food equity to the school and community, but learning about it. The West Lines Food Forest was deliberately set up as a gleaning forest so that anybody could come and harvest from it and enjoy it. And the London Christian Academy students have witnessed a woman regularly coming to fill a bag with fresh food from the adjacent community garden and food forest, and then have had conversations about where food comes from, and have also been amazed at watching pumpkins grow from seed to these big sprawling plants with bright orange pumpkins, and totally novel for some of the students, which any of you who have outdoor or learning gardens at your school will be familiar with, that the disconnect that students can have between where their food comes from on their plate and how it grows and how it's harvested and the whole life cycle process. And another opportunity is that we teach about ecosystem services and what the ecosystem provides for us, but with a permaculture perspective and an Indigenous perspective of reciprocity, there's really an opportunity to teach about the services that we can provide to the ecosystem, and tending a forest garden is a great way to do that. So instilling that learning in children can help shift our collective mindset towards a cultural environmental responsibility that can bring us back to connection with nature, and not see us as other and above or different from, but as part of.
So here's a video of my daughter Aria and I watching the groundhog. Aria spontaneously creates a poem.
Is he acting funny again? Aria, why do you have to bother him? Why don't you just leave him alone? He's eating grass.
What is that skull doing?
Huh?
It's nice for sweets and love for love. A groundhog is here on the grass eating grass. Grass is love, home is sweet. Sweet is love and sweet is truth. Close to passes nice. Path is nice, all the trees.
I love that. Spontaneous poem.
You can't see the food forest in this video, but it's right next to this grassy patch here. So with the Gibbons Park Montessori School, a big problem that we had was the children only stay for their preschool years, sometimes 1 to 2 years, and then they move on to another school. So parental involvement in the garden was originally strong, but dwindled because those original parents that installed the garden were gone along with the kids that were there. And because the food forest is situated within a larger public park, there are often seeds that fly in. We have to spend quite a bit of effort weeding those out. I know the word weed is a bit of a construct on how you see things, but the issue is that some of those weeds might overtake the garden, especially in those beginning years when the garden is just starting to get established. So we need to give the garden a helping hand. Because Gibbons Park Montessori School is a Montessori school, it attracts parents and children from everywhere around London. Some folks would drive in from Lucan, Ilderton, and Arva. And because parents were anxious to get their children home, they weren't necessarily interested in staying to help out with the food forest. The neighbors that live next door to the school were sometimes more involved than the parents were. For regular community members, they saw the food forest as a school responsibility because it's on private land. We need to find new patterns or ways of doing things that are outside of the box. The regular teachers have a strict curriculum and structured program. The summer teachers are actually more interested in what's growing in the food forest. The Thames River is situated very close to the yard. And because of safety concerns, the teachers are anxious to shepherd the children into the enclosure. More teaching occurs in the small garden in the enclosure, as opposed to the food forest, which is open and is not contained. So if the food forest was enclosed, then we think more education would happen there. We see more curriculum support as needed for the teachers. The Montessori curriculum emphasizes growing and being able to identify plants and realizing the benefits of plants, but there isn't any curriculum support that necessarily ties the food forest with the Montessori curriculum. Like, for example, a lesson plan with a story that they could relate to the food forest, or harvesting plants like rose hips, for example, and using it to make jam. But then we run into issues with food and safety. Specific curriculum tied to Ontario grade level expectation will make it easier for teachers to incorporate. There are some plants that never took off, and there are new plants that we put in, like supporting beneficial plants for pollination or native plants. So we need to install maps on site and be constantly updating them based on the new plants that we're putting in. I also think we need to create plant labels, maybe a laminated sheet with the plant name and a short description of what it is, so people know what they're looking at, like the benefits of this plant or the relationships with other pollinators, for example.
So I got very similar feedback from the London Christian Academy. Because they're a specialized school, they draw from a wide catchment area as well, and families are often driving for 20 minutes or more to get to or from the school, and they're not as likely to stay and be involved afterwards. As the teacher noted, there was also the students that were involved in planting the food forest or in the site preparation at the beginning stayed engaged for their following years at the school. But those that have only been involved in doing their curriculum stuff on site and tying it into lesson planning he's noticed they've been less engaged in the following years when they're not in his class. So for grade 7 and 8. And I don't know, I'm not sure if it has to do with just somehow institutionalizing it. It's not as fun. Like when I remember having to read books that I probably would have liked on my own, but when I had to read them for school and write a book report on them and analyze them and talk about them, then they weren't as enjoyable. So I'm not sure if that's why that's coming into play. Some teachers are just naturally able to bring their students outdoors and integrate it into the curriculum, but it's not second nature to everybody. So I know this particular teacher has tried to get some of the younger grades involved, but it's challenging when they're not his students. And then he's noted that there are other staff that teach biodiversity as well, but they have not been using the food forest to do that. So perhaps some better resources would help support them in that. In terms of, I think better site maps and support with plant identification would be helpful as well. The funding models often heavily lean towards materials and not necessarily professional expertise. So there was very little funding towards the design of the Westline Food Forest, and then a very tight timeline of approval between funding approval and when we needed to get things in the ground, as well as me having a 2-month-old at the time meant that it was rather rushed. And then there was never a subsequent map produced that had the details of the understory species and what was actually planted where. Once you get to the ordering stage, sometimes substitutions have to be made, or things get moved a little bit when they're planted, or people donate things and you squeeze them in. So it's always good to include that in your budgeting and planning, to have that ability to update things afterwards.
Jessica and Joanna, I just wanted to say that we're at about 5 minutes until the question portion, okay?
Great, thank you very much. Okay, so curriculum resources. There are not a lot tied directly to food forests. I know there's a lot for community, for gardens, because they've become quite popular in schools. We're going to look at a few here. So the Children in Permaculture website has a list of searchable activities. And they've got lots of other resources as well. They have a book that they published that you can access online. This is great for looking up a particular topic. So they've got a plethora of ideas here. They do have one on food forests. And then they have 2 age groups, 3 to 6-year-olds or 7 to 12-year-olds. We'll just let it search for all. And then holistic planning. So if you're looking for specifically something that will engage the head or the heart or the hand and eyes, you can do that. So these are the symbols for that. So you can see these are for the younger children. So to engage the eyes, you could observe different shapes that are shifting and changing in the clouds, or I would add, you could add find different shapes in the plants that are growing. You can, to engage the hands, you could play with the wind and see where there are pockets in the microclimates where there's more wind or less wind, where it's protected. And for the older children, oh, wait a minute, I didn't apply the, there we go. That's why it wasn't making sense. So now, sorry, I hadn't applied the search. Now we're in growing food, not air. So, yeah, being in a woodland and noticing the different smells and sounds and textures there versus in the field next to it. If you have a knowledgeable adult around, being able to harvest and eat things straight from the food forest. Learning new vocabulary, doing some maintenance of the food forest by pruning, removing tree guards, dealing with weeds, sitting quietly in a food forest and listening, drawing, or writing a poem. So I think from my discussion with the London, the teacher at the London Christian Academy, it was he was definitely using it for science curriculum, but there are so many other ways that you could integrate into the, so many other ways that you could integrate a food forest into curriculum across the board. So this is the Children in Permaculture book that they've created. You can purchase a hard copy of it, or you can access it for free online, but you can only, you can't print it or download the PDF or anything. You just have to look at it online. And they have some great exercises here as well. So I don't think I can click on that, but if we go to page 87, we have some. So some sample session plans. So like one on meeting the forest. So they have different school themes that you can meet with this lesson plan: mathematics, language, science, social sciences, health, well-being, arts, what seasons you can do this lesson plan, what setting to do it in. This is for 3 to 6 year olds. So yes, pretty detailed information on, and that should make it easier to integrate into curriculum. Then there's Matt Powers is the permaculture student. He has developed US accredited permaculture curriculum. And there's a handout that I should have put in the chat at the very beginning, but I'll do that momentarily. There's a PDF that I made that has these links on it. So Matt Powers has different books, ebooks that are available, and there's lesson plans, and some of them are like $1. So you can get a lesson plan on sheep mulching and composting, and it's $1, or on school gardens. So there's also the World Wildlife Federation and the Canadian Wildlife Federation have some programs on planting with native plants and biodiversity gardening. Sorry, I can't touch my mouse because everything jumps around. And so those are some great resources too. Those are on the handout. And then I also am going to include, now where is my mouse? Sorry, now I've lost my mouse and it won't. Joanna, are you able to upload that PDF into the chat? Oh, now I see things again. Okay, I'm just going to go to it this way. So I'll put this in the chat. This is from the Children's Permaculture Guild, and it's a lesson plan on soil. So it has lots of different activities to do. What is soil? How is it made? Demonstrations, activities, games you can do, and homework to do. How to test your own backyard soil. And so I'm going to stop my share there, and I want to add these to the chat right now before. Okay, so Joanna added the resource handout. I'm going to add the.
Well, while you do that, Joanna, Jessica, thank you so much. You've inspired a plethora of chat and questions. So we do have a couple of minutes. So I'm going to go through and ask some of the questions out loud that are kind of in this big chat string. You guys are so engaged, and a shout out to Susan for all of your resources you shared. Thank you for that. And if anybody on the call wants to ask a question out loud and be in this space, you're welcome to either raise your hand or just turn on your camera and mic, and we can ask questions that way as well. So I'm going to start at the start. I think it was Ariana who very early on said she was very excited about all of this, but has no idea where to start. Doesn't know much about plants or what kind of soil would be good. And so where did you start, like ground zero with food forests?
Food forests come into, I guess, the larger context of permaculture is often how people come to food forests. So there's lots of different books on permaculture that touch on food forests. And Gaia's Garden is one that I frequently recommend to people. And it's really accessible. Sorry, very accessible read, and to introduction, and as well as like practical things you can do to get started. There are some pretty dense manuals like Edible Forest Gardens Volume 1 and Volume 2 that cost as much as university textbooks, that are not a good place to start, but good if you want to get really into the details. I don't know. I've been doing it for a while now. I don't know. I can't remember how I started with food forests. I'd say getting into permaculture, start down that rabbit hole, and you'll find lots of directions to go. There are lots of people that teach online now as well. There's a great summit happening this weekend actually on designing your permaculture property, but a lot of those people have integrated food forests into their site design, and it's free, and it's offered by Verge Permaculture. So I'll just put that link in. Oh, maybe it's not CA, but Joanna, do you have anything to add to it? How did you get into? Yeah, it is .ca.
How did I get into food forest? I was following Becky Ellis around for a while at the library. One of my someone that we know in our community, and that's actually how Jesse and I met at the library. I don't know. I started getting really interested in the concept of food forests, and then I just got involved with all these different projects, and then seeing them on the ground, like with Gabor's. Gabor had a ton of projects going on, and then the one that at Lester B. Pearson, there was that one, and just learning just by being there and planting and observing. I don't I don't know what
I think you're right, though. I'm reaching out to the community. As soon as you're interested, those people, they'll find you too.
pop up. They find you,
Yeah.
and you
Yeah.
find them, and then you get together with like-minded people, and it just happens. You know, it's when gatherings become happenings.
And there are permaculture, like there's a Permaculture Ontario Facebook group, there's a Permaculture Canada Facebook group. There's definitely, like, I know there's chapters in Toronto, there's groups that meet in Toronto and Hamilton. There's probably in your city or region, there's other people that are doing it. You just need to find them.
Perfect. It kind of dovetails into the next question. And so it was noted that both of the schools you worked with were private schools. Would you think that something like this would work in the same sort of way in a public school system? And what sort of challenges or differences might there be there?
So I have done a bit of work with some with the public system in London, and there's definitely more hesitance towards fruit trees. You know, they're all they've kind of gotten on the bandwagon of pollinator gardens, which is great. And there's quite a number of them are starting to do, you know, vegetable gardens as well. But there's this disconnect where a pollinator garden is okay because it, you know, only attracts butterflies, never bees, but an apple tree will attract bees, and then a child will get stung, and then there's going to be a lawsuit and there's going to be problems. And we certainly can't have nuts because somebody might be allergic and they might throw them at each other. And then, so I've definitely found a lot more issues with liability in the public system and hesitancy around that. But I think there's just, you know, there's a disconnect that pollinator gardens are being embraced, and they attract the same insects that are going to be attracted by a food forest. So
yeah, I guess every school district, especially nationwide, would be a little bit different. So maybe talk to administration and see where they sit.
Yeah.
There.
And I think, I mean, the beauty of the West Lions Food Forest is that the London Christian Academy had nothing to do with it really. They've kind of piggybacked onto it, but they weren't involved in the planning or the design, it would have been great if they had been. I didn't feel that engagement from them. There's also the first food forest we planted in London was the Carolinian Food Forest, which has two schools nearby, a high school and an elementary school. And they've been involved as well in about the same capacity as the London Christian Academy in terms of, there was one teacher who was passionate, who would bring her students out every year and be involved, but it's on public land. So that's sort of a way to get around that legal issue, is if there's a park nearby and you can get the residents engaged in the area and get it planted on public land, but then utilize it as a school resource, I think that's the easiest way to do it.
Well, there are a few more questions in there, and I know that it's 3:30, so I do want to be or 3:30 for me, 5:30 for you. Do want to be very respectful of everyone's time. So if everyone could just please join me in a great big thank you to Jessica and Joanna. We will make this recording available, and so you'll be able to go back in and look at the slides, and we're going to try to figure out a way to share these resources afterwards as well. So
sure. Can I just pop up our contact info for a second too, so that if anybody has, you know, if there's burning questions that you didn't get answered, feel free to email Joanna or myself.
Yeah, so if you have further questions or your question didn't get answered, send them a note, and this recording will also be available. So thank you so much for everyone's time. Enjoy your e-comming and nuivering and all the great things. So thank you so much.
Thank you.